We are going to look at the brain stem. Who knows the parts of the brain stem?
The brain stem is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata.
So those are the parts of the midbrain. From proximal to distal, we have the midbrain, then the pons, then the medulla oblongata. The brain stem mainly contains the ascending and descending tracts. They pass through the brain stem. From the spinal cord, they enter the brain stem. From the cerebrum, they enter the brain stem. So it contains ascending and descending tracts. The brain stem contains centers which regulate vital functions. For example, the respiratory center, the cardiovascular center. You go and read about those centers. The respiratory center, the cardiovascular, the reticular formation, which stimulates you to remain awake. The emesis center for vomiting, and other vital centers. So it contains ascending and descending tract and centers which control vital functions. The brainstem also contains nuclei of cranial nerves. You've been looking at cranial nerves. Most of their nuclei are within the brain stem. So if you have injury to the brain stem, you're going to be affecting the tracts. You're likely to affect the vital centers, which may be lethal, and you're likely to also affect the nuclei of cranial nerves. You may lose cranial nerve functions because those structures are located in the brain stem. So, is this a transverse, coronal, or sagittal section of the brain?
That is sagittal.
It's a sagittal section of the brain, and you can see our cerebrum on top, the corpus callosum, the cavum septum pellucidum is there, the fornix is there, our thalamus is there, and below the thalamus you have the midbrain. Below the midbrain you have the pons, and below the pons you have the medulla oblongata, and these three parts are the ones which constitute the brain stem. We are going to begin with the medulla oblongata, then we shall look at the pons, and then we shall finalize by looking at the midbrain. And this is the brain stem, and we have looked at how those parts of the brain stem are arranged. So the medulla oblongata is the most inferior of all parts of the brain stem, and it is continuous with the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. I believe by now most of you are familiar with the foramen magnum. Please get time in your groups and come and study the skull. Get time in your groups to come and study the skull and the brain specimens. You have two sessions, the skull and the brain specimens. So the medulla oblongata is continuous with the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. On the anterior aspect of the medulla oblongata, you're going to see the pyramids. I talked about the pyramids when I was looking at the descending tracts. When the descending tracts reach the medulla oblongata, they form the pyramids, and you can visualize those pyramids on the anterior aspect of the medulla oblongata as two ridges. I will show them to you. But they contain corticospinal tracts. And we saw that at the level of the medulla oblongata, that is where the pyramids decussate at the decussation of pyramids. So this is the front view of our medulla oblongata. Superior to it, you have the pons. So these two ridges are the ones which are known as the pyramids containing the corticospinal tract, and they are separated in the midline by what we call the anterior midline fissure. Posterior to the pyramids, you have this bulge. This bulge contains a nucleus known as the olivary nucleus. That is why this bulge posterolateral to the pyramids on the medulla oblongata is known as the olive because it contains the olive, which is very important also. It connects the medulla oblongata. You remember the inferior olivary nucleus, which is contained within this olive. Separating the pyramids from the olive is the anterolateral sulcus. And within the lateral sulcus, we are seeing the roots of the hypoglossal nerve originating. Then posterior to the olive, we are going to see different roots of cranial nerves. From top to bottom, or from superior to inferior, we have the root of the abducent nerve. Then we go to the facial nerve. It has a large motor root and a small sensory. Then we have the vestibulocochlear nerve. Then we have the glossopharyngeal nerve. Then you have the roots of the vagus nerve. And then here you have the accessory nerve. These nerves protrude from the medulla oblongata posterior to the olive and anterior to the olive in the anterolateral sulcus. That's where we see the roots of the hypoglossal nerve originating. So this is the front view of the medulla oblongata. Now we are going to make a cross section. This is where we have the decussation of pyramids. They decussate inferiorly. So this is the point where we have the decussation of pyramids, where 90% of these corticospinal tracts crosses to the opposite side. The same applies to the other side. You remember very well. And you remember 10% remain on the ipsilateral side. And then when they reach the level of the spinal cord, they also decussate. So we are going to make a cross section at the level of the decussation of pyramids. And we are going to look inside the medulla oblongata so that we see what is contained within the medulla oblongata at the level of the decussation of pyramids. So when you make a cross section at the level of the decussation of pyramids, this is the anterior view. You're going to see the anterior median fissure, and then these bulges are the two pyramids. On the inside, you're going to see the decussation of pyramids. You can see these corticospinal tracts crossing to the other side, and these ones crossing to the other side. So this is made at the level of pyramids. Anterolateral, you're going to see the anterior spinal cerebellar tract, which is an ascending tract, lateral spinal thalamic tract, and a posterior spinal cerebellar tract. These three tracts can be visualized in the cross section of the medulla at the level of the decussation of pyramids and the lateral aspect. Then we are going to see the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Then we shall see the central canal, which is part of the ventricular system. And posteriorly, we are going to see the nucleus cuneatus and the nucleus gracilis for the fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis. So those are the major structures you see at the cross-section of the medulla oblongata at the level of the decussation of pyramids. These are the structures. Then we are going to make another cross-section through the medulla oblongata at the level of the medial meniscus. Remember the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. The first order neurons are sent up to the medulla and synapse with second order neurons in the fasciculus gracilis and in the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. Then the second order neurons are these ones. They are going to cross to the opposite side and ascend to the thalamus as the medial meniscus. So at the level of the medulla oblongata, we are having the medial lemniscus. Those are second order neurons from nucleus cuneatus and nucleus gracilis, decussating to ascend to the thalamus for fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. So at the level where they decussate, we make another cross section through the medulla oblongata. That is the level of the decussation of the medial lemniscus. We are going to see the pyramids before they decussate. And laterally, we're going to see our ascending tracts, which we talked about, the anterior spinocerebellar tract, the lateral spinothalamic tract, and the posterior spinocerebellar tract. Then we are also going to see first of all, we're also going to see the inferior olivary nucleus. This contributes to the olive. And we saw that the inferior olivary nucleus, that is where climbing fibers originate from before they enter the cerebellum. That is the inferior olivary nucleus. Then we are going to see the nucleus ambiguus, which is part of the vagus nerve nuclei. Then these other tracts, what we call the medial longitudinal fasciculus. You're going to find out what the medial longitudinal fasciculus is, that tract. Then we have the hypoglossal nerve nucleus. The central canal is still there. Our spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve can still be seen. And then the nucleus cuneatus and nucleus gracilis. These are the structures visualized in the cross section of the medulla oblongata at the level of the medial lemniscus decussation. That is it. Then we are going to see what is located within the medulla oblongata at the level of the olivary nucleus. At the level of the olivary nucleus. At the level of the olivary nucleus, we are going to still see our pyramids. Our pyramids. And we saw that posterior to the pyramids, you have this bulge, which is the olive. And that is where you find the olivary nucleus, posterolateral. Then the medial lemniscus can also be seen. These are still fibers of the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus ascending to the thalamus. We can see the tectospinal tract, which is one of the descending tracts of the extrapyramidal system. I talked about it. Still, we are going to also see the nucleus ambiguus, which is part of the vagus nerve. Then you can see the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve becoming smaller. Then we are going to see our inferior cerebellar peduncle, which connects the cerebellum to the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. You begin seeing it at the level of the olivary nucleus. The inferior vestibular nucleus, which is part of the vestibulocochlear nerve, can also be visualized. You can see the nucleus of the solitary tract. You go and read about those nuclei. The dorsal nucleus of the vagus nerve. When you're looking at the vagus nerve, you saw the nuclei of the vagus nerve. Then the medial vestibular nucleus, part of the vestibulocochlear nerve, have the medial vestibular nucleus. Then we have the hypoglossal nerve nucleus. And mainly importantly, at the level of the olivary nucleus, when you make a cross section through the medulla oblongata, then you will see our fourth ventricle. Our next lecture is on the ventricular system. So we have looked at the medulla oblongata as the most distal part of the brain stem. We have looked at how it looks like externally on the anterior surface. We have looked at the cross-section of the medulla oblongata at the level of the decussation of pyramids, at the level of the decussation of the medial lemniscus, and at the level of the olivary nucleus. Those are the most important levels which show us the structures which are on the inside of the medulla oblongata. Some of the centers, it contains the cardiovascular center, which alters the rate and force of cardiac contraction and also alters the tone of the smooth muscles of the blood vessels. We have the respiratory rhythm test center. I don't know whether you have done this with Mr. Chagulai. The respiratory rhythm test center, which is connected to that of the pons. We also have the emesis center, which induces vomiting during situations of intoxication within your blood, the swallowing or deglutition center, the coughing center, the hiccuping center, the sneezing center. The medulla oblongata is very important. You can imagine if the cardiovascular center and the respiratory rhythm center, which controls your breathing movements, are injured, that can lead to death. That is why when a person has injury to the brain stem, because the brain stem contains vital centers which control vital functions of the body, they will consider that person brain dead. Whenever they say that someone is brain dead, they mean that the brain stem of that individual has been injured severely. And why do they call them brain dead? Because the brain stem contains vital centers which control the heart, which control breathing and other vital functions. And these are some which are contained within the medulla oblongata. Some of the cranial nerves which have their nuclei within the medulla oblongata, we have these cranial nerves having their nuclei: trochlear nerve, hypoglossal nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, vagus nerve, and accessory nerve. Injury to the medulla oblongata can lead to dysfunction of these nerves because they would have injured, the injury would have affected their nuclei. And when a nucleus of a cranial nerve is affected, that cranial nerve can no longer function. So you can see our pyramids and then the olives deep to it. The posterior view, this is the posterior view. This was the anterior view. This is the posterior view of the medulla oblongata. And you're going to see a tubercle in the midline, two tubercles in the midline containing the nucleus gracilis, known as gracile tubercles. And then in the midline, they are separated by what we call the posterior median sulcus. Lateral to them, you're going to see another bulge known as the cuneate tubercle containing the nucleus cuneatus. It's very important. Then this region is known as the area postrema. This area postrema is the one which contains the vomiting center, and this is the one which anti-vomiting drugs inhibit. When they give you anti-vomiting drugs, they inhibit the area postrema. The blood passing through the area postrema is the one which induces vomiting. If it is intoxicated, this area postrema is going to stimulate the GIT and then the pharynx to induce the vomiting reflex. The vagal triangle contains the nuclei of the vagus nerve. The hypoglossal triangle contains the nuclei of the hypoglossal nerves. So this is what you see on the posterior aspect of the medulla oblongata, and this is what you see on the anterior aspect of the medulla oblongata. Please, when you get time, and I know you get time, study them. So the major nuclei with the nuclei which have most of their, the cranial nerves which have most of their nuclei within the medulla oblongata are these ones. These ones I mentioned first, they protrude from, their roots are seen coming out of the medulla oblongata externally, these ones. However, these ones are the ones whose nuclei are contained within the medulla oblongata. Now we should distinguish. Externally, you can see very many cranial nerve nuclei protruding from the medulla oblongata. But on the inside, these are the ones who have their nuclei on the inside. Cranial nerve number 8, cranial nerve number 9, cranial nerve number 10, cranial nerve number 11, and cranial nerve number 12. They are the ones whose nuclei are contained within the medulla oblongata. Related nuclei, nucleus gracilis, nucleus cuneatus, olivary nuclei, these are known as related nuclei. Impulses move to those nuclei as they are ascending to the cerebrum or to the cerebellum. That's why they call them relay nuclei. And these are the relay nuclei which are located within the medulla oblongata. These are the cranial nerve nuclei which are located in the medulla oblongata. And we have seen the 3 cross sections and what we see at the level of those 3 cross sections. So this is the sagittal section of a preserved brain. We have brains. You must come as groups and study them. And this is our brain stem, the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain is at that point. And when you look at the midbrain, you can see the cerebral aqueduct passing through the midbrain. And here we can see the 4th ventricle. Part of it is posterior to the pons, and part of it is posterior to the upper part of the medulla oblongata. The reticular formation runs through the entire brain stem. That is why we are going to see it in each part of the brain stem. It is a network of neurons which runs through the brain stem from the level of the medulla oblongata to the thalamus. And this reticular formation connects to all parts of the cerebral cortex. We saw it. It picks any sensory impulse which comes to the brain stem and it transmits it throughout the entire brain so that your brain is awake. So the stimuli which enter the reticular formation activate it. And when it's activated, it stimulates the entire brain. So that's why it's connected to the entire cerebrum. It stimulates the entire cerebrum so that you keep awake. Sound, temperature, touch, anything that can stimulate it can induce awakefulness. Right now you are awake because there is sound, there is light activating the reticular formation and it is keeping you awake. Meaning that if the reticular formation is injured, your level of consciousness are going to decrease. You're going to have sleepy states. And if it is entirely damaged, you're going to go into coma, you cannot awake. And part of it is located in the medulla oblongata, and I have given you the different notes. So part of it is in the medulla, part of it in the pons, part of it in the midbrain. And it connects to the thalamus. You remember the reticular nucleus of the thalamus. So any stimulus which comes to it, be it visual, be it from ascending tracts from skin, be it from the ears, it can stimulate it, and when it is stimulated, it stimulates the reticular nucleus of the thalamus, and when the reticular nucleus of the thalamus is stimulated, it will also stimulate the entire cerebrum so that you remain awake. So I've talked about the vital centers which are located in the medulla oblongata. There's also what we call the salivatory nucleus, which controls salivation. You read about them. So these are some of the centers which are located in the medulla oblongata, the respiratory centers. We have the ventral group and the dorsal group. All of them control respiration. You're going to go and read about them and their functions. We have other respiratory centers in the pons, the apneustic center, and then we also have the pneumotaxic centers. Now, members, I want you to go and read about how these respiratory centers function. And these are the ones which make the brain stem a vital part, such that if it is injured, these respiratory centers are cut off and you stop breathing and you will die. The blood supply to the medulla oblongata. This is the medulla oblongata. And these are the blood vessels, the anterior spinal, the posterior spinal, the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, and the vertebral arteries. And this is what you are saying. This is the medulla oblongata. These two are vertebral arteries. They are coming from the subclavian artery, first part of the subclavian artery. They move along the spinal cord, then they enter the cranial cavity through the foramen magnum, and they move along the medulla oblongata. These two are vertebral arteries. When the vertebral arteries reach the junction of the pons and the medulla, they join to form the basilar artery. So these two vertebral arteries are branches of the first part of the subclavian artery. They are going to give off branches posteriorly. They are going to give off a branch known as the posterior inferior cerebellar. The posterior inferior cerebellar supplies part of the medulla, and then it goes to the inferior surface of the medulla. This posterior inferior cerebellar is going to give off a branch known as the posterior spinal. The posterior spine is also going to give branches to the lower part of the medulla. Anteriorly, the two vertebrae are going to give off branches which are going to unite in the middle to form the anterior spinal artery, which is also going to supply the medulla oblongata. Why is the medulla oblongata well perfused with blood? Why does it have all these blood vessels? Because the vital centers need blood at all times. So here we are talking about the different regions where the different blood vessels supply when you make a cross-section at the level of the decussation of pyramids, at the level of the decussation of the medullary meniscus, and the level of the olives. The different colors indicate the different blood vessels which supply the inner aspect of the medulla oblongata. The next part of the midbrain, which is superior to the medulla oblongata, is the pons. We have seen that the two vertebral arteries join at the junction of the medulla oblongata and the pons. And because the pons is between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata, the pons is between the midbrain superior to it and the medulla oblongata inferior to it. That's why the word pons means bridge. The word pons means bridge. It bridges the medulla oblongata to the midbrain. Bridges. Its anterior surface is convex. However, it has a groove in the midline for the basilar artery. The anterior surface of the pons is convex. However, in the midline, it has a groove where the basilar artery passes, known as the basilar groove. This one. So that is the part of the brainstem known as the pons. Superior to it is the midbrain. Inferior to it, you have the medulla oblongata. The anterior surface is convex, but in the midline, it has a groove known as the basilar groove. When you make a cross-section of the medulla oblongata at the level of the nucleus of the facial nerve, when you make a cross-section through the medulla oblongata at the level of the nucleus of the facial nerve, at the level of the nucleus of the facial nerve, or at the level of the facial nerve. So you're going to see our motor nucleus of the facial nerve, the fibers coming from it, moving posteriorly, and then they will move and wind posterior to the nucleus of the abducent nerve, and then they come out anteriorly. So you're going to see the facial nerve, and it's the fibers of the neurons which originate from the facial nerve, their axons moving posteriorly and winding around the nucleus of the abducent nerve, and then they curve and come out anteriorly. Then you're also going to see the nucleus of the abducent nerve. Then you're going to see anteriorly the medial lemniscus. And there are fibers connecting these two medial lemnisci known as the trapezoid bodies. But mainly you see the medial lemniscus, the facial nerve nucleus, the abducent nerve nucleus, and then you're going to see the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Remember, the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve is long. We are seeing it in the medulla oblongata. Now we are also seeing it in the pons, the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The inferior cerebellar peduncle, we saw it. And then the vestibular nucleus, part of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Then the cavity of the fourth ventricle. And then the superior cerebellar peduncle. Here we are seeing the inferior cerebellar peduncle, the superior cerebellar peduncle, and this one, which is the middle cerebellar peduncle, at the level of the facial nerve nucleus. This tissue around here is made up of very many neurons which are connected. This is what we call the reticular formation. This is what we see when we make a cross section through the pons at the level of the nucleus of the facial nerve. We can also see the corticospinal tracts. These ones, when they reach the medulla oblongata, they will become the pyramids anterior. So this is what is seen when you make a cross section through the pons at the level of the nucleus of the facial nerve. Let's go back and see that properly. So we are having our nerve there. So this is a lower section at the level of the facial nerve nucleus. Now we are going to make another cross section at the level of the nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, because this is the trigeminal nerve. It has a big sensory root and a small motor root. So we have been making a cross section at the level of the facial nerve nucleus. Now we are going to make it at the level of the trigeminal nerve nucleus, and we see the difference of what is located on the inside of the pons. So this is what we saw at the level of the facial nerve nucleus. And when you make at a higher level, at the level of the trigeminal nerve nucleus, the first thing you should identify is the trigeminal nerve, a motor root and a main sensory root, the trigeminal nerves. The medial lemniscus can also be seen. And then the corticospinal tracts, which when they reach the medulla will become the pyramids. Our reticular formation can be seen in that region. The cavity of the fourth ventricle can be seen. The middle cerebellar peduncle is there, and the superior cerebellar peduncle is there. However, the inferior has gone out of view. So we can compare the two sections at the level of the facial nerve nucleus, what is on the inside of the pons, and at the level of the trigeminal nerve nucleus, what is on the inside of the pons. Now, the nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, the nucleus of the abducent nerve, the nucleus of the facial nerve, and the part of the nucleus of the vestibulocochlear nerve. These are the cranial nerve nuclei located in the pons. The vestibulocochlear, part of it was in the medulla, part of it is the pons. The respiratory centers, that is the acoustic and pneumotactic centers, are also located in the pons. Please go back and read these vital centers and how they perform their functions. Tracts which relay information to and from the cerebellum, like the peduncles, the cerebellar peduncles. So the pons is a very important connection to the cerebellum because it contains the cerebellar peduncles. So the tracts that process and relay information to and from the cerebellum are the cerebellar peduncles. You saw the ascending and the descending tracts also passing through it. And these are the images we are going to be bringing for the exam. These are the images. We are not going to bring anatomical images. We are going to be bringing radiological images, and you must be able to identify the parts of the brain. And I want you to study these images: sagittal section of the brain, coronal section of the brain, transverse section of the brain. Then you also have to come to look at those brain specimens and also look at the skull. And that is serious. So on the posterior aspect of the pons, you have the fourth ventricle. And that fourth ventricle is there. This is the pons. Posterior to it, you have a fourth ventricle. After the fourth ventricle, you have the cerebellum. And superiorly, the fourth ventricle connects to the cerebral aqueduct of the midbrain. And inferiorly, it connects to the central canal of the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. So the functions of the pons are the functions of the vital centers located in it, are the functions of the cranial nerves, are the functions of the tracts. So the functions of the tracts, the functions of the cranial nerve nuclei, the functions of the vital centers are the functions of the pons. Blood supply to the pons, it is the basilar artery. I said the basilar artery moves on the anterior surface of the pons, grooving it to form the basilar groove. And this basilar artery is the one which gives off pontine arteries. These are pontine arteries. We have short ones which are paramedian and long ones. So all these are pontine arteries, branches of the basilar artery. They supply the pons with blood. The most proximal part of the midbrain, of the brainstem, is the midbrain. The most proximal part of the brainstem is the midbrain. When you make a cross-section of the midbrain, before we look at the different levels, when you make a cross-section of the midbrain, or when you make a transverse section of the midbrain, you're going to see two major regions. When you make a transverse section of the midbrain, you're going to see two major regions. A posterior region known as the tectum, containing these bulges. They are bulges which are in pairs. A pair of bulges superiorly and a pair of bulges inferiorly. The two bulges superior are known as the superior colliculi, which are part of the visual pathway controlling visual reflexes, and two pairs of bulges inferiorly are known as inferior colliculi, which are part of the auditory system and they control auditory reflexes. So these pairs of bulges, the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi, are located on the posterior part of the midbrain, which is known as the tectum. So the tectum is the posterior part of the midbrain, and the cerebral peduncle is the anterior part of the midbrain. This cerebral peduncle contains a region known as the tegmentum, the crus cerebri, and the substantia nigra. However, looking at them visually is the most important. I wanted us to see the colliculi. However, I may not be having a very good image of the colliculi to show you. However, let me at least show you. This is the medulla oblongata. This is the pons. This is the midbrain. In sagittal section, this is the midbrain. This is the region of the thalamus where you have the third ventricle. The third ventricle connects to the cerebral aqueduct, and this cerebral aqueduct passes through the midbrain. Then the cerebral aqueduct connects to the fourth ventricle, and the fourth ventricle connects to the central canal of the spinal cord and the medulla oblongata. Now, you have seen that the midbrain is split into two by this cerebral aqueduct. This posterior part is what we call the tectum, and this anterior part is what we call the cerebropeduncle. This is the tectum, this is the cerebropeduncle. The tectum has a pair of bulges superiorly known as superior colliculi, and a pair of bulges inferiorly known as the inferior colliculi. They are contained within the posterior part of the midbrain known as the tectum. And then the anterior part of the midbrain is known as the cerebropeduncles, and they are separated by this part of the ventricular system known as the cerebral aqueduct, through which cerebrospinal fluid passes, that is, as it is moving from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. So that is the tectum containing the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi, and this is the cerebropeduncle. This cerebropeduncle, as I connect, contains what we call the tegmentum, the substantia nigra, and then the crus, as we shall see. So this is the cross-section of the midbrain. So you can make a cross-section of the midbrain at the level of the inferior colliculi, and you can make a cross-section of the midbrain at the level of the superior colliculi. So there are two major cross-sections of the midbrain, at the level of the inferior colliculi and at the level of the superior colliculi. Let's see. So this is the cross-section of the midbrain at the level of the inferior colliculi. This is the posterior view. This is the anterior view. So you can see our cerebral aqueduct passing through the midbrain. Posterior to it is the tectum, and because we are at the level of the inferior colliculus, this tectum, we shall see the two bulges of the inferior colliculi on the left and on the right. So the posterior to the cerebral aqueduct have the tectum, and these are the inferior colliculi, because we are making this cross-section at the level of the inferior colliculi. The region anterior, this entire region anterior to the cerebral aqueduct is what we call the cerebropeduncle. So you can see this is the cerebropeduncle and this is the tectum, and the boundary is the cerebral aqueduct. So what are the divisions of the cerebropeduncles? We have this area immediately anterior to the cerebral aqueduct is the tegmentum. This is the tegmentum. Then this is part of the basal ganglia known as the substantia nigra. It contains melanin, that is why it looks black. And substantia nigra means black substance. The substantia nigra. And then this is the crus. This is the crus containing descending tracts, corticospinal tracts. So when you make a cross section at the level of the inferior colliculi, you will see them in the tectum, cerebral aqueduct, and this is all cerebropeduncle. The cerebropeduncle is made up of the tegmentum, substantia nigra, and then the crus cerebri with the cortical spinal tract. What else do we see apart from those parts at the level of the inferior colliculus? We are going to see the fibers of the superior cerebellar peduncle and their decussation. Then we are going to see the nucleus of the trochlear nerve. The nucleus of the trochlear nerve is located at the level of the inferior colliculi. When you make a transverse section at the level of the superior colliculi, you're going to see the tectum containing the superior colliculi, a bulge on the left and a bulge on the right. And this region is the tectum. The cerebral aqueduct is there. This entire region is the cerebral peduncle. This region is the tegmentum, the substantia nigra, and the crus cerebri. So we are seeing the superior colliculi posterior to the cerebral aqueduct as part of the tectum. The cerebral aqueduct. What do we find within the tegmentum? Within the tegmentum, at the level of the superior colliculus, you're going to see the nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. Remember, at the level of the inferior colliculi, we saw the nucleus of the trochlear nerve. Now, at the level of the superior colliculi, you see the nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. Then we are going to see the tracts. This one contains the medial meniscus, the spinothalamic tract, and the trigeminothalamic tracts. These tracts are seen at the level of the superior colliculus. And then the red nucleus. You remember the rubrospinal tract? So on the inside of the tegmentum, remember, anterior to the cerebral aqueduct, to have the cerebral peduncles. The cerebral peduncles have three regions: the tegmentum, the substantia nigra, which is part of the basal ganglia, and the crus cerebri containing the descending tracts. So this tegmentum at the level of the superior colliculus, we have seen, contains the nucleus of the oculomotor nerve, spinothalamic, trigeminothalamic, medial meniscus, the ascending tracts, you can see them, and the red nucleus. These are the major parts, major structures located in the tegmentum at the level of the superior colliculus. Then we have our substantia nigra. It has what we call pars compacta and pars reticulata. Then we have the crus cerebri. The differences in these two sections is within the tegmentum. The rest may be the tectum. Here you see the inferior colliculi. Here you see the trochlear nerve nucleus. But at the level of the superior colliculi, here you see the superior colliculi. Here you see the ascending tracts, red nucleus, and cranial nerve 3 nucleus. So those are the two major cross sections at the level of the midbrain, the level at the superior colliculus and the level at the inferior colliculus. Don't forget the parts of the midbrain, the tectum, and the cerebral peduncle, and the three parts of the cerebral peduncles. And when you look inside the tegmentum, that's where the major differences come between the two sections. So you have seen that the oculomotor nucleus, nerve nucleus, the trochlear nerve nucleus, and the mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal nerve are contained within the midbrain. The tectum contains two pairs of superior colliculi and two pairs of inferior colliculi. All the four are the ones which are known as the corpora quadrigemina, because you have two superior colliculi and two inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi coordinate visual reflexes and inferior colliculi auditory reflexes. So I say the superior colliculi regulate reflex movements of the eyes and head towards the source of stimuli. Remember the tectospinal tract. That when a bright light suddenly appears in a person's field of view, there's a reflex turn of the eyes to focus on it. When a person hears a sudden loud noise, there is a reflex turning of the head towards that noise. When part of the shoulder is tapped, there's a reflex turning of the head towards the source of stimulus. Those are the reflexes which are controlled by the superior colliculi, and they are lost when they are injured. The inferior colliculi are centers of auditory reflexes. They cause reflex vocalizations. Reflex vocalizations are vocalizations which you do without your voluntary control. Something just scares you and you scream. You do not think about it, it just comes reflexly. And inferior colliculus is the one which controls reflex vocalizations. What about the tegmentum of the midbrain, the substantia nigra, and the crus? Those are the parts of the cerebral peduncles. And these are the functions of the red nucleus. The red nucleus is at the level of the superior colliculus. And we talked about it when we were looking at the rubro-spinal tract. Fibers coming from the red nucleus descending down to the spinal cord. They participate in the control of muscle tone, complex movements of the muscles, writing reflexes. Is a reflex that corrects the orientation of the body when it is taken out of the normal upright position. When the body is out of the normal upright position, it is immediately corrected and you go back. That's a writing reflex. It is controlled by the red nucleus. Control of the movements of the eyeball, control of skill movements. This shows you that the red nucleus works hand in hand or coordinates with the cerebellum, the medulla, the cerebellum, the basal ganglia, and the motor areas of the cerebrum. It is part of the motor system. Blood supply to the midbrain, the posterior cerebral artery. Give the posterior cerebral artery, we shall look at it when you're looking at the blood supply of the brain. Because next time you're looking at the ventricular system, and then after the ventricular system, you're going to look at the blood supply of the brain. And after looking at the blood supply of the brain, then you can study the blood supply of all parts of the brain, which I've looked at in our lectures. There is an artery, which is the final bifurcation of the basilar. Let's go back and look at it. This is the basilar artery. It finally bifurcates into what we call the posterior cerebral artery. This is the posterior cerebral artery, the final bifurcation of the basilar. It's the one that we have been talking about here. This posterior cerebral artery gives off a branch known as the peduncula artery, which is going to go to supply the cerebral peduncles. The superior cerebellar artery, this indicates that this artery supplies the superior surface of the cerebellum. The superior cerebellar artery supplies the superior surface of the cerebellum. It also gives off branches to the midbrain. Posterior choroidal artery, branch of the internal carotid. Interpendancular branch of the basilar artery. This basilar artery gives off what we call the interpendancular branch. All these blood vessels contribute to the supply of the midbrain. However, they have other parts that they supply, but they contribute branches to the midbrain. And these are the branches supplying the midbrain. And these are the regions on the inside of the midbrain that they supply. And this is at the level of the superior colliculus because you can see the two red nuclei. We have ended our lecture on the brainstem. Our next lecture is going to be ventricular system. All lectures I give are important radiologically. Let no student underestimate any of them. You must get time to come and look at those brain specimens and also look at the skull, to look at the structure of that skull and the foramina through which the cranial nerves pass, so that you can identify them practically, because they are going to be a very important part of your study.